It's 9:30, so it's time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells local plan. First of all, can everyone hear me at the back? Okay, voice is just about surviving. It's got to Friday, so it should be okay. As before, if anybody can't hear me, please wave or let me know. Let's see traffic noise, etc. If everyone can try and speak loudly and clearly, so as everyone in the room can hear, but also for the City Council's website as well. So welcome back for those of you who were here yesterday and on previous days, and welcome along for those of you who haven't yet attended one of these sessions. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. The Programme Officer, Charlotte Clancy, can't be with us this week. Hannah, who's just stood up at the back, will introduce herself and say hello. Hannah stepped in for Charlotte this week. They both use the same email address. It's still the Bank Solutions email address. So if anybody does have any queries about the examination, documents, attending sessions, etc., please do still use the email address you've got. Or if there's any queries with regard to attending this morning or this afternoon session, feel free to grab Hannah and we'll be in the back of the room throughout the session. I'll just hand over to Hannah just to run through the fire emergency procedures.
In the event of the fire alarm being continuously, you must immediately evacuate the building at a pace. Officers will escort you by the most direct available route. No one is to use the lift. We will make our way to the fire assembly point by the entrance to the town hall yard car park on Wandsworth Way. Once outside, the check will be made to ensure that everyone has safety nets and no one will be able to go on Fridays at 2 p.m, a fire alarm will ring briefly to test the system. This is not a fire drill unless the bell continues to ring continuously. I also have to mention that the sound is having a couple of hearing problems. So it's the microphone's really sensitive, picking up like paper ruffling and things like that, and whispering as well. So if you try not to, obviously it's very difficult to not ruffle paper and such, but just try and keep whispering everything to a minimum, because it's very, very difficult to hear people talking if there's a lot of background noise to the microphones. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. So this afternoon then at 2 o'clock the fire alarm will sound, but that's the test. Yeah. Very quickly run through the format of today and what we're going to be talking about. So I know there's a few new faces around the table who haven't attended any of the previous sessions. We've moved on in the examination to start looking at some of the soundness issues and justification for the plan. And yesterday we looked at some policies as well. And this week we've been looking at housing needs, so the numbers, and we've been looking at spatial strategy and distribution. Today we're moving on to look at the principle of green belt release and the site selection methodology. And what I would just say again, really, keep myself and reiterate to this stage, and this week we are looking at sort of strategic level issues rather than getting too drawn down into any specific detail. Obviously, we've got the days allocated for each of the allocations in the plan, where we can discuss those matters in greater detail and have greater time. As I said on previous days, really, we'll go through the matters, issues and questions. There's no set agenda for today. So I'll sort of lead the discussion, ask questions of the council. It is a hearing, it isn't structured discussion, so please do feel free to participate. Just raise your nameplate on its end if you'd like to enter the discussion. More than happy for you to do that, but please do stick to the representations that you've raised. Here is not an opportunity to start introducing any substantive new points or new evidence, and no presentation of evidence or cross-examination of witnesses or anything like that. It really is a structured discussion led by myself. Before we go around the table and introduce ourselves, any housekeeping matters from the council these days? No. And none from yourself, Hannah? There's nothing. Okay. As per previous days, we'll go through the matters, issues and questions. We'll have a break mid-morning, and I'd like to think we would get done in time for lunch at or around to 1 o'clock. Okay, we'll go around the table. If I can start with the council and ask everybody to introduce themselves to the hearing. For those representatives, you can just let me know who you are, if you're acting on behalf of a particular client or landowner or local community, and that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Paul Cheverevian, Queen's Counsel, acting for the council.
David Marlowe, acting for the Borough Council.
David Scully, Acting by the Officer, Tunbridge Wells Borough Council.
Sarah Young, Director of Planning at LUC, prepared the Greenbelt study.
Gregory Jones, Queen's Council, instructed by Provision on behalf of Cooper Estate Strategic Plan.
Morning, sir. Catherine Miles, Provision, on behalf of the Cooper Estate Strategic Plan.
Good morning, sir. My name is Colin Smith, instructed by Leander Holmes.
I'm here representing Hadlow Estate.
Good morning, my name is Lawrence Badley. I'm here for temporary on behalf of Hadlow Estate.
So Paul Roberts, also of Turnberry, also on behalf of Hadlow Estate.
So Mark Walker and Royal Tunbridge Wells Town Following to organisations and
Morning, sir. Peter Akurinos, a member of the Speldeff Road Community Action.
Julie Davis, CPRA, the Countryside Charity.
Tunbridge Wells Green Party.
Good morning, Elizabeth Strang, also a member of the Speldeff Road Community Action Group.
Robert Azarati, here as an individual. Can I just introduce myself? I'm a retired civil servant, used to work for the Treasury and the Cabinet Office at Director and Chief Executive level. I'm not a planning or legal expert. I am passionate about the countryside. I'm a trustee of the Capel Greenbelt Protection Society, a registered charity which encourages people to use the countryside, chair of the Capel Path Rangers and chair of the Friends of Capel Church. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Alan Kindred of CBRE representing Dandara. We've got various interests in the plan, including Paddock Wood.
Good morning, Jane Piper from Barton Wilmore, representing Crescents and North West.
Good morning, sir. Yes, Douglas Bond of Wolf Bond Planning, here on behalf of Castle Hill Developments Limited.
Good morning, sir. David Neame from Neame Sutton, here on behalf of Riding Homes Limited.
Morning, Troy Hayes, Chartered Town Planner, Managing Director of Troy Planning and Design, here on behalf of Paddock Wood Town Council.
And sir, Paul Brown, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of Save Cape.
Okay, thank you all very much. Apologies for doing a lot of pointing to people at the back of the room. Can't read nameplates that for long. We'll get to know each other as the weeks go on. By the end of it, I'll know everyone's name. But at this stage, I might be just pointing to people. Okay, what I want to do is we'll go through matters, issues and questions, some of which we'll spend more time on than others really. And I think really the first question essentially was a point of clarification for the council, and that was to just confirm that all of the table 6 of the submission plan, that they are all the changes to the Greenbelt boundary. We talked about Colebrook House yesterday, so that we'd come back to that one in particular. But for all intents and purposes, then, so there's no other changes to the Greenbelt boundary that the local plan is seeking to make, either removing or reducing. The second question really was a question of context to understand the issues and understand this. And I think I said there, what portion of new housing proposed in plans on land currently designated Greenbelt. And I think the council's clarified that around 46% of allocations in Greenbelt, around 32% of the original supply is in Greenbelt. And again, we won't get drawn into the numbers. We've had lots of discussion this week around that. We'll come on to look at really methodology between. Now, question 3 is where we'll start to get into the sort of meat of this issue really. So before concluding that exceptional circumstances exist to justify changes to Greenbelt boundaries, National planning policy tells us that strategic policy making authorities, in this case the local planning authority, should be able to demonstrate that it has examined fully all other reasonable options for meeting its identified housing need. This will be assessed through the examination and will consider whether the strategy has done various things. One of those points is that it needs to be informed by discussions with neighbouring authorities. I'm not proposing to go back over that again because we've had lots of that in the duty vote session, and we'll also actually discuss that again on Wednesday in the context of the strategy and whether or not council could actually at a high level meet its needs beyond the green belt. So I don't propose to go over that. But the first 2 points we will go into. So the first requirement framework, it's asking councils to make as much use as possible of suitable brownfield sites and underutilised land. And the second point is seeking to optimise the density of development, and this is the point that CPRE yesterday were making around densities in particular. So looking at the first point, and also seeing representations on this, say Cable in particular has put forward sites and suggestions and other ways in which this plan could have met needs. So how has the council critically assessed the suitability of its brownfield sites and underutilised land to determine whether or not needs could have been met in the first instance on previously developed land, essentially, without going to the buildings?
Morning, sir. I'll kick off if I may. The council has actually prepared as further to its essentially looking at brownfield land and indeed urban land more generally, a specific topic paper on this subject, which you'll have access to. So that's for reference is CD 3.83. And you'll see from the specific paper how the Borough Council has indeed looked at this. And I think it's worth highlighting a few points. I think within the plan itself, then we have a specific brownfield land policy, strategic policy dealing with brownfield land. This was something that was introduced at the pre-submission stage in response to comments. And I think it's always been in the background. It's drawn out as a strategic policy. That's complemented by policy H2 of the plan that looks to make efficient use of land having regard to local circumstances. In terms of the actual, there are a number, as you alluded to in the statistics, a number of brownfield sites which we have been confident that can come forward and are allocated within the plan, both in and around central areas and elsewhere. Indeed, go as far as to say that we've looked at brownfield sites even outside of settlements where we feel that they can overall be sustainable. I'll draw your attention to those in Benenden Parish. So we have essentially looked as far as we can at brownfield sites. I think also when you're talking about brownfield sites, it's important to mention, obviously most brownfield sites within urban areas come through windfall development. So it's a question of to what extent can the Borough Council identify or make a windfall allowance that takes full account of this potential, so as not to unnecessarily require the development of greenfield land. And this is something that the topic paper looks particularly at, and there's a fair bit of analysis in there of what has happened in the past, what may happen in the future with current trends, including in relation to development rights, and we've substantially increased the allowance, such that overall there is an allowance for some 1,670 dwellings as a windfall allowance on large and small sites. We've of course restricted large site windfall allowance to urban sites, because we have in the past obviously had a lot of greenfield windfalls without an up-to-date plan. So we've looked carefully at that, mindful of the need, as I'm sure people around the table may point you to the need for compelling evidence for windfalls. But we believe there is that. Indeed, it's been accepted at a couple of recent appeals that the council's approach is reasonable. So that's important, because obviously overall it has the impact of increasing density in urban areas.
Within the topic paper, did that just look at brownfield sites, or did that also brownfield and urban land topic paper? So did that look at other parcels of land within urban areas that maybe aren't previously developed but were surplus to requirements that could have come forward? Or was it just looking at buildings essentially and car parks and things like that? Was it any sort of open space or assessment or anything like that you looked at?
In terms of the windfall allowance, it covered all sites. In terms of site allocations, if that's what you're thinking about. Obviously, the council did an open space assessment as well, and looked at both playing fields and local green spaces. In terms of any other sites within the urban area, I'm struggling to think of any that perhaps weren't already developed. There's a lot of previously developed land, of course, but we obviously looked at all the sites that were submitted to us through the Sheila process.
And as part of this, did you discount sites with a yield of 10 or less, or 9 or? Were we just looking at sites that could deliver 10 or more today? That's what you did in part of allocating sites, didn't you? We'll come and talk about that this afternoon. So that was a threshold that was used for allocating sites, but for considering like the capacity of say, Royal Tunbridge Wells, what did you do with the sites that may have only yielded 5-6 new houses? Were they discounted, or were they taken into account?
They're essentially built into the small windfall sites allowance. We did do a follow-up exercise from the initial assessment, looking again at sites that we felt would yield less than 10, to see if at a higher density we could get them over the 10 threshold essentially in order to allocate them. It was proactive in that sense. But from memory, I don't think that there was nothing that really, most of the sites were quite small, at the lower end of the scale. So we went through that exercise, but essentially, they are built into the windfall allowance.
And what did this work lead you on to? Did it lead to a capacity? Did you have a figure in mind, say, right, okay, our urban areas can deliver X number of new homes, therefore there's a shortfall to find somewhere? We talked about the strategy, why the council looked at the green belt, etc. What was the purpose of this study? At what stage did it come in the plan making process? And how did the council take into account its results? So was it informing the plan and informing decisions about greenbelt, or was it post decisions about greenbelt release and talk about yesterday, sort of looking again? Just to set a bit of a context as to how this document was actually used and its role and purpose.
It has been undertaken through the process, and in essence, and I think typical of most, if not all, local plans, the objective is to identify what the residual requirement is in terms of your need for allocations. And you've looked at your existing commitments in terms of planning permissions and your realistic potential for windfall sites to come forward. That was done leading up to the draft plan, and it was reassessed. And as I think I mentioned in yesterday's discussion, that we did the further work, which gave us more confidence to have a much higher windfall provision. And that clearly is set out, and you'll see from the actual local plan itself, where we set out the housing needs, that we essentially deduct the windfall allowance for both large and small sites. Previously, we've only looked at small site windfall allowance. We've now increased that to have a larger sites allowance, not least because of sort of structural changes, which then leads on to essentially a residual requirement for allocations.
So on the small sites, what's your annual windfall allowance for small sites coming forward then?
I knew that off the top of my head, but I'm being asked the question. I want to double check. Yes, it's 98 dwellings a year for the first 7 years of the plan. I'm sorry, I say the first 7 years. That's excluding the first 3 years of the plan, on the basis that they'll be reflected by extant planning permission.
Yeah.
And then 78 dwellings a year for the remaining 7 years of the plan.
How does that compare to, looking back over the last 5 to 10 years, does that reflect the numbers through small site windfalls within, like 600 wells? Is that reflective of what's been through?
It is, yes. I think it's we give the figures overall, and it's not the full amount, but we're conscious that we have to sort of have the compelling evidence. It's difficult to be precise on this, so you'll see in the tables that we and the supporting information that it is we're confident it can be accommodated with, we're likely to get that. We may get a little bit more, but there's uncertainty around that.
Just move on then to density, and then I'll open this sort of discussion up. On density then, how have you optimised the density of development? This leads upon the point Steve Barry was making yesterday afternoon, that density, increasing density within both allocations within the urban area, but also elsewhere as well. So some of the other allocations that we've
We're very conscious of the NPPF in relation to density, which focuses in terms of density in central and accessible locations, and we set out in the topic paper the densities of which are substantially brownfield sites in the plan, and you'll see that they are higher densities. Elsewhere, and reflecting the overall policy on density, we looked at sites initially on the sort of essentially most fringe sites to 30 dwellings per hectare. Varied that according to the sort of the site circumstances. Within the urban areas, you'll find there are sort of somewhat higher densities, and indeed Royal Tunbridge Wells, I think couple of the urban sites, particularly one relatively close to the town centre, we increased between the draft and pre-submission stage. So they are now at a sort of a level for you to the we put it as an appendix into the hearing statement. Appendix 3. You will see that the central ones, Royal Tunbridge Wells, we have RTW 3, RTW 4, RTW 7 isn't central, but it's still a higher density, and the same with RTW 11. So we've sort of done what is realistic. We've I think we're sort of conscious of we've looked at what developers are likely to expect. We have to be realistic in this respect as well. And where they have looked for high densities, we've looked at are these deliverable. I think the density allocations themselves reflect those. No doubt when you get to specific settlements, your particular individual size.
Yeah, in your appendix 3, so this is appendix 3 to council's matter statement, matter 4. Dwellings per hectare on brownfield sites allocated for residential development. Is there such a table for other allocations?
No, there isn't at the moment. You'd have to refer to the Sheila sheets. We can certainly do that when we go through the site, the settlements. I'm not sure of course, I know when I've certainly been through them, we're looking at around sort of 30 hectares on average, 30 to 40, less in some cases where you've got site-specific constraints. But is that no? If it's something you want to, I'm sure we could.
I think it'd be useful. So I think that's the point that we touched on yesterday. So it was across the CPR email. I think, correct me if I'm wrong. Around this issue, the criticism was, well, you've got these allocations on the greenfield sites on the edges of settlements, but they're actually of a relatively low density. And if you'd taken, correct me if I'm wrong, if you'd taken a different approach and actually sought to optimise or maximise the density of development on those sites, then in turn, you're putting less pressure on the need to take as much land out of greenbelt, essentially. So I think it would be useful to have that table. So that just looks at the brownfield site. I think the representation points to me that actually having such a low density of development everywhere else, the knock on is that you've still got houses to find, essentially, and hence why you start looking at the greenbelt or having so much development in the greenbelt was the criticism. Was that about right?
Yes, thank you for explaining, clarifying our position from yesterday. Very helpful for everybody here that wasn't able to attend yesterday. Can I develop the issue on a little bit? That I welcome the fact that council have gone back to look at the capacity on brownfield sites and that the windfall allowance will be increased accordingly. By definition, the windfall sites aren't allocated, and therefore when you come to look at what density they will be on the ground development, you'll be using policy H2 on density, which has been written. I think the council say that actually they haven't defined density because they want to be flexible. And specifically to have regard to the character of the area, and there's a bit of a misbalance here as well. The character of the area, all well and important, but going back to that main issue about trying to minimise the amount of open space, countryside, greenbelt, A and B that's lost, those windfall sites that come along also need to be optimised. And by not being aspirational in terms of density, I just feel the council's missing a trick, and in suggesting from the council's position to meet housing need that you have to let go of greenbelt and A and B, that there needs to be some sort of payoff in density optimisation. And I think the council's done a good reckoning of what they've got on Appendix 3. They know the kinds of yields that are coming up. They've got their own evidence there. Could that not be translated into a commitment to a density? And if they feel they're unable to commit to a density plan, shouldn't they be referencing the densities in the National Design Code, which are way more aspirational, more appropriate? Talking about densities at 30 dwellings per hectare is a low suburban density. This hearing statement paper says they'll consider a lower density and a higher density. But I just think the council needs to be really aspirational in terms of density. I know that CBRE get a lot of flack because we think NIMBYs and we don't like housing. I said yesterday, we don't object to housing, we want housing in the right places. And that was something that my colleague said from the Royal Tunbridge Wells Town Forum. They actually want to see increased densities for all these reasons, that they value the countryside. And perhaps those of you living and working in this area are becoming blinkered to the value of the greenbelt. The value of your countryside is certainly very different to where I live. And I think that is your norm, and I think you ought to look at the area with fresh eyes. You have to live in a very special area, and you should be doing everything you can to protect the greenbelt and, of course, the countryside and the A and B. And the mechanism for that is for increasing density. And if that's too hard to do, you need to go back to paragraph 11B and look again at your requirement. Thank you.
We'll work down the table, so the gentleman next to you.
Thank you, John Ellis from Tunbridge Wells Green Party. To emphasise the need for that broader table of densities. From the Borough's Green Belt study, I can just take two examples, and this is not in my backyard, but it's about a mile away. Spratford Farm, the density is only 20, and then Green Belt, and the nearby Green Belt and the Wirevale Garden Centre, the density is only about 6 to 12. So I think there are some low density greenbelt uses in the plan. What concerns me, and I put in the hearing statement, is I've not seen in the plan any mechanism for ensuring that brownfield sites are actually developed early or first, rather than, frankly, the more juicy and profitable greenfield, and again coming to boil water, is that my factory and the BT site of RTW 12 and 13, which are brownfield sites. I welcome everybody, we welcome them being developed, but I'm sure the developers would rather go to Rathsly and the garden centre first and leave the factory to go rusty. So what mechanism is there to ensure that doesn't happen? Finally, while I'm speaking, I've just got a comment back on to thanks to the council for providing the very useful table in their hearing statement of the greenbelt allocations. The observation is that if we're at 46% of total allocations going ahead and 32% across the total, it implies that there is zero greenbelt allocation in the instant planning permissions. And I'm following the figures before Henting and back then as well. Suddenly we went from a norm of no greenbelt take to a landed at about 50%. My figures agree with yours. And I think that's the point before Reg 18, there should have been a red flashing light to relook at the strategy for means together with the government and so on to reduce the numbers, as we said yesterday. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think what we heard from the council was that they're giving a generous windfall allowance on large and small sites. But I'd say, isn't that indicative that they haven't actually done the work to actually locate where they could deliver more urban sites, previously developed sites? That's one of my points. So I think it's indicative of the council's approach of not looking carefully at its previously developed lands. Second point I just want to make is looking at the council's list of proposed brownfield site allocations in the pre-submission local plan. That's table 5 of the brownfield and urban land topic paper. I just had a look at the largest site within that, which is ALRTW7. That's land at the gasworks, Sandhurst Road and Tunbridge Wells. I believe that was an allocation from the previous local plan. So it's really a question as to how many of these are simply just sites that have been rolled forward from the previous local plan. I don't know if there's planning permissions in there as well, but again, it's indicative of the fact that the largest site the council's come up with within its brownfield is a site that was already identified previously and in its previous local plan.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. So can I begin by saying that the question that you've asked, have they done enough in terms of looking at brownfield optimizing density? The answer to that, it's not a binary one. I'm sure you appreciate that there's a quantitative element to it as well. I mean, you may well come to the conclusion that Tunbridge Wells cannot conceivably meet all of its housing need without going into the green belt. But then you also need to ask, how much green belt do you need? Do you need one garden village? Do you even need a garden village? Do you need 2? Could you do it with a series of smaller releases, for example, on the edge of Tunbridge Wells? And therefore, there is a very real question about the where within the spectrum the analysis lies. Secondly, sir, inevitably in coming to these conclusions, there are things that need to be balanced. So, for example, the council has a concern that other sites, such as brownfield sites, must be sustainable. It has a concern under density in relation to impacts on character. But the character of some areas is more important than others. Sustainability in terms of access to public transport is again, it's a spectrum. It's not a black and white issue. And there may be brownfield sites that perform less well in sustainability terms, but you've got to balance the disadvantage of that against the very, very considerable importance that national policy places on greenbelt and the non-release of it. So in all of these things, there are judgments to be made against a backdrop where, as I say, the starting point is the release of greenbelt should be exceptional. In those circumstances, sir, Safe Cable's position is that the council hasn't done enough. You've been referred to the topic paper and the various measures that sets out. Well, sir, firstly, as far as the general policy is concerned, that's laudable, it's well and good, but it is not an answer to the question, does the council have an adequate 5-year housing land supply? Where are the sites that it's going to find? It might help in terms of bringing forward windfalls, but that policy itself is not an answer to the question, have you gone and looked and seen what you've got in the cupboard? Similarly, sir, windfall is not an answer to that question. Windfall is effectively saying, well, we haven't looked properly through the cupboard. It's the point Mr. Hayes made a moment ago about how carefully we've gone through. And for some of the smaller sites, that may be understandable, but for some of the larger sites, it does beg the question, how carefully should you look? And this really, sir, is where Safe Cable has a problem with the analysis that's been done. I note at the moment that the topic paper is produced as a response to points we raised at the Regulation 19 stage. That of itself raises questions in our mind, at least, about the extent to which this has truly informed the strategy. That strategy existed already. or is it a retrospective justification? I appreciate that some of the work it refers to had been happening even before the topic paper was written, but nonetheless, there are parts of the work there which were only done after we raised concerns, at which point in time the strategy had already been settled. And to that extent, it's quite clear that it hasn't informed the plan. But so as we've set out in our hearing statement, so in the hearing statement, we've simply summarised work that we've carried out that is set out in more detail in our own Regulation 19 responses. But for example, in our hearing statement, paragraph 6, we've referred to the fact that the council rejected some 323 brownfield sites. We haven't looked at all of those. We took a sample of 90 in 3 parishes. And of those 90, there were 43 which we thought had been rejected wrongly, that they were suitable for inclusion. So we might be right, we might be wrong about that, maybe more, maybe less. But given that that's less than a third of the overall number of sites that were rejected, we find it hard to believe that there are not more sites out there that could have been brought in. And in particular, so those 43, as we've said in the statement, of themselves would have provided potential for around 2,270 units. That's a very, very significant part of a garden village. Even if half of those were viable, suitable, available, question whether you would have needed to go to a garden village, question whether something else may have been appropriate. And so that is important because one of the council's reasons for rejecting some of those sites is they're not big enough. But that's a chicken and egg situation. They're not big enough is only relevant once you've identified a certain scale of need. But you don't get to knowing what the scale of need is until you've worked out what you can accommodate on your brownfield sites. And so one of the other issues with these is the extent to which, as far as we can see, the council has actually rigorously gone away and chased some of what is there in brownfield terms. Some of these sites have been rejected on the basis that they're not, in the council's views, deliverable, for example, because the owner hasn't put it forward or advocated it in the SHELA. So when you are looking at a situation where if there are inadequate brownfield sites or not a sufficient number available, you are going to have to release green belt land. It should not be enough for a council to be essentially reactive to that process. The council has a database of brownfield sites. It should be knocking on the doors of those landowners and asking them, what is happening with this site. And in that sense, it's the last point we note under this question in our representation. Government's had 2 rounds of grants available for brownfield land release funds. Tunbridge Wells hasn't applied for either of those. And that seems to us to be indicative of the lack of appetite for really genuinely grappling with the question, have we made the most of brownfield? So in terms of optimising, I endorse entirely what's been said by CPRE, not going to repeat it, but it is self-evident that you've got a balance here. One understands the idea, the desire not to have too much density on particular sites. There may well, in circumstances, be adverse consequences from over-densification. But you have to balance that against the fact that if you do not up densities, you will by definition need more land, more greenfield land, and in the present case, more green belt land. And that harm, in our submission, is extremely weighty when placed on the scales in terms of what might be perceived as the downside of upping densities. But so as far as upping densities go, I stand entirely behind what CPRE and others have said. A density of 30 dph in order to save land from greenbelt release is incredibly and disappointingly low. So the last thing that I would say, and I do it knowing how difficult it is to bring forward a local plan against a constantly changing backdrop, you do have to draw a line at some stage. But what we have been through over the last 2 years, the whole COVID pandemic, has and will continue to produce significant changes in the way we use land. We know that Tunbridge Wells has carried out a review. I understand reference was made to it earlier in the week. The plan doesn't take that on board, but one can readily see that in terms of office space requirements, retail space requirements, there are going to be significant changes in the way we use urban land. There will be opportunities there for densification, for changes to residential use, which may not have been there previously. So that needs to be factored into the question whether or not there are the sort of exceptional circumstances, whether enough has been done in terms of brownfield land and optimising. Get the nod, sir. I think I've probably talked enough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Shall to come back and have points, sir?
Thank you, sir. I think just on the density point, and it is a difficult one when you're talking about aspirational in an AUNB. I believe the actual aspiration is to actually have development that's in keeping with the AUNB and the pattern of development and the form of development and the type of development in the AUNB. That doesn't mean lower densities, though. It'd be wrong to typify that. In certain contexts, it will be a relatively high density within the AUNB, and then others not so. I would, just on the general density point that's been made, I would refer, perhaps for future discussions if we're looking at a site, to the National Design Code, which talks about what densities can be reasonably expected in different situations. And in fact, in the village context, it doesn't give a density. It is essentially down to character, as Mr. Brown has highlighted as a key consideration. And we've had regard to that, but certainly in the context of looking to avoid low density. I think the suggestion was made by Mr. Azarati about Brownfield first, and I can understand that, but we cannot justify it in the situation that we have. And as I say, it's the emphasis, as has been pointed out, is where we can identify brownfield sites that we should, and we have. And there are new sites in there that essentially form perhaps former existing, in some cases, employment sites that we accept could be redeveloped for housing without detriment to the employment needs, meeting the employment needs of the area. And I say that there are new sites there. The Windford, you cannot always identify these sites though. If you're talking about small commercial sites, you know, they do come forward. You don't know if one has cropped up in representations. I noticed that a franchise has been lost, or whether or not it could be reused. We don't know at the moment. So it is right to have that allowance. It is a new allowance. And I should have said, of course, as well, that we have made specific allowance in the pre-submission local plan for additional housing in the town centre of Tunbridge Wells, and that's baked into the actual into the policy. I should also point out that we do have used the Brownfield Land Register, and indeed we've included within that register the allocations that we're making on brownfield sites, although it's still got to go through this process as part of being proactive in that respect. So, I'm confident the council's doing what it can within, to meet the NPPF requirements in both Greenbelt and in general terms.
Can I very briefly to that? Without going into site-specific details, reference was made to a couple of sites which are allocations, which are brownfield allocations that would include the site allocations on the plan. The ones that spring to mind, the gas holding sites, and additionally the sites at the top end of Tunbridge Wells, the lifestyle forward one, both sites been carried forward. Both sites, the amount of housing allocated has increased based on further work about the impact and potential for increased scale without affecting the character of the area. The council, I think the examples of how the council has specifically looked at capacity densities on brownfield sites which are available.
This one's question 4 really, which is, can housing needs be met by optimising use of previously developed land and buildings without requiring land to be released? And the alternatives that Mr. Brown talks about and that say people have suggested, are all of those sites considered in the Sheila document?
They're all considered, or if the capacities were small, we've considered them all, is the answer. And a number are put forward, others are addressed through the Sheila, others, as Mr. Brown said, were small sites that we felt would be, they would be picked up through the small sites allowance. And we've had regard to those in that sort of potential, making the small sites allowance. But obviously others that we felt were unsuitable.
Did we'll go on to talk about this probably, did the Sheila have a limit then? Do you look at all sites, or if it was for X number of dwellings, you just automatically excluded them and said, well, that would be a windfall?
Well, we dealt with this afternoon. I think in essence the sites were looked at to see if they could yield 10 dwellings. I think initially there was smaller sites considered.
So if they couldn't, they didn't go forward in the Sheila.
I don't think there's a Sheila sheet for
those small sites.
I think that's the case. Mr. Gilbert will clarify that this afternoon, but I believe that's the case. But I know we did look at smaller sites as part of the work, just to see if they could yield more.
So can I just say on that, I mean, I don't want to go, I don't know the detail of the 43 sites, we could turn it up if we need to. But 43 sites on Save Cable's calculations gave 2,270 units. That's an average of around 50 dwellings per site. I'm not saying there aren't any small sites within that 43, but quite clearly across the group as a whole, most would not have fallen into the category where they were rejected just because they were windfalls.
But equally, these sites within the website can look at them in great detail, but these sites aren't all brownfield sites, are they?
Ones we would, my understanding is yes.
Predominantly, I would say.
Certainly say.
And are they all within Royal Tunbridge Wells or across
three packages we looked at were really around our knowledge base, which is around the Cable area. But we just didn't have. But are they consistent with Tunbridge Borough? Oh, absolutely. Yes.
It's not just that you were just looking at the town.
No. We did have resources to go across the whole level.
Mr. Jones.
Just on that point, to just add, because my client site is one of these sites, I think Save Cable indicate as a site, and of course our client site is in the green belt, but I just reiterate what Mr. Brown said, it's not all or it's not a binary answer, and the shift towards looking, we say it should have probably been done, but it hasn't been done, towards a more sustainable approach, at least looking and assessing it around Tunbridge Wells, would lead possibly to some sites being released from the green belt, but not the mass green belt release that's being proposed at the moment.
Yes, lady in the right, not everyone.
Hi, excuse me if this is not the right time to raise this, but both, okay, I didn't get the gentleman's name, mentioned that he has made additional housing allowances for possible development within Tunbridge Wells plan itself. But how much additional allowances? You have no idea how much housing you're going to find in Tunbridge Wells borough when you start their plan. You're talking about small brownfield sites, you're talking about central accessible locations. All the sites that you might find when you go into Tunbridge Wells Borough town plan will have central locations. You yourself talked about needing to increase the footfall, needing to increase the vibrancy and vitality of the town centre. Using these small brownfield sites, which you haven't yet looked at, will do exactly what you want. So you can't possibly think of removing green belt until we look closer at what's in the town centre itself. I'm not sure if we're going to discuss that later, but you both mentioned the future town plan. So I'm just supporting the idea that there are lots of brownfield sites to be looked at, and I did list them in my submission. So, thank you.
So to bring this part to a conclusion, then, is the council satisfied that it has looked sufficiently at these other options and in enough detail, considering other things, raising densities, any changing circumstances, sites that might have become available recently, etc.
I believe so, sir. I think, yes, is the short answer. In answer to Mr. Strang's point about the town centre, obviously it is complex. Where we are confident that sites coming forward, they are allocated within the plan. Cinema site being the largest, of course, former cinema site. But we've also thought, in line with national policy, local circumstances, potentials, we feel that there is scope between 150 and 200 dwellings within the town centre on top of what's already permitted and allocated. So we've made that provision, and we are looking to, as you know, to carry that forward through, to confirm that, hopefully, through the town centre area plan, and that's the key thing which is being progressed at the moment. So I think, yes, sir. I think there's all the sites that you go through the sites anyway. If there are mission sites that people are promoting, as provision are conscientiously, then albeit in the greenfield site in the green belt, and actually safe capable support, you will look at those particular those cases as we go through. But I'm confident the council's done what it reasonably can, and where there are potential sites is
okay.
So I just add one final thing in relation to the sites that Safe Haven put forward. I think it's really important to note that a number of them are either in existing use, they are fundamental to the operation of facilities. One is a village hall, for example, and its associated car park. So the council has been through all of those, and there are an awful lot which are listed within that, which have existing uses. They are not available, or they are, as I said, they are fundamental to the operation of other.
I can look at that piece on myself. I'm not going to each of those now.
So what I'm going to do is have that table with the densities in relation to and then you can interrogate the council's approach to density when we come to look at the individual sites as well, which assist.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, and especially as we go through and start to look at some of these. I think you're right. In some cases, clearly, a site would have a low density because it's appropriate in that particular instance to do so. It's not just a overarching view. But I do want to move on because in question 4 we've talked about and answered. Question 5 is a question that has been asked under the strategy day. So it's going to propose that we go back through this. That was not all of Tunbridge Wells is within the green belt, so could the new housing or there or that by developing beyond the existing green belt boundary. If not, why not? We discussed that quite some detail actually on the special strategy day, both in the morning and the afternoon, around could the council go beyond the green belt? Yes, potentially you could, but we talked about the reasons why the council hasn't done that. We do want to turn to question 6, and probably actually question 6 and 7 go together, because this is a point that I think Mr. Jones was making. And what the framework says in paragraph 142, it says when the drawing up or reviewing green belt boundary, the need to promote sustainable patterns of development should be taken into account. So this comes back to the sort of sustainability strand of this argument, and it's we've talked about the numbers, we talked about the strategy. So where in the evidence base has the council taken this into account in greenbelt terms? When looking at greenbelt releases, how is the council taking into account the requirements to promote sustainable patterns of development? So the criticism of representatives has been, okay, you know you need to release green belt, and we'll take forward, obviously, look at representations that are being made. Let's put ourselves in a position as a council, we know we need to make some changes to the green belt boundary. We're not going to go and meet our needs beyond it, because these places are further away, less accessible, etc., etc. So how then did you start to sort of unpick the sort of spatial strategy and the geography of the area? I think it goes back to what Mr. Jones was making about the obvious answer would be your principal main town. So how did the council sort of take this into account, and you can consider it, where's that set out?
Well, some of this was covered previously, so in the strategy discussions we had in terms of showing how we looked at rural Tunbridge Wells and the issues and constraints there. And we also looked at once you discount the A&OB for a strategic development, there are very few opportunities in which one could deliver the quantum of developments that in terms of needs. I mean, we get no numbers as a separate discussion. And looking at sustainable locations, or locations that could be made sustainable. And so at Reg 18 stage, we had a distribution of development topic paper, which you have, so which is CD 3.16. And the consideration of the potential for development in the green belt is given detailed consideration from page 31 onwards, and including identifying exceptional circumstances for the release of green belts. It goes through the process there in terms of setting out how the strategy for development was maximise development within the built-out areas and optimise densities. That's on page 33. It goes on to talk about the land of Paddockwood and Jubilee, starting on page 34, and how it has approached that issue.
So when we talked yesterday, and you helpfully went, because I had a bit of a tour of Tunbridge Wells, didn't we? We looked at the sort of periphery of the town and various sites that you looked at as council. Clearly within that process and with, you know, the judgment to be made. Some sites, council completely had a greater level of landscape impact or greater harm to X, Y, and Z. But equally, would be on the edge of the principal town, so we have, you know, accessibility, walking, cycling, walking to town, train station, etc. So where's that sort of balancing? Where's that? Where are those judgments and sort of weighting of different issues set out? What documents sort of points me to where that process has been undertaken?
I think essentially, so it would be the, as Mr. Scully said, the distribution and development topic paper, and then the subsequent development strategy topic paper, which takes you through in section 6 quite extensively the development of the strategy. You know, reviewing the draft plan proposals, opportunities to meet the consideration of alternative strategies, what we just discussed, making effective use of land-developed areas and brownfield sites, into the site assessment process. Specific consideration in each of those sections on greenbelt, AONB, flood risk, the infrastructure.
So just come back to yesterday, we talked about Chile Village, and we talked about paragraph 105 of the framework, and that was about locating significant development central locations which are or can be made sustainable. We had a discussion yesterday, didn't we, about ultimately the answer to that question probably will come after we then talked about the detail. We've understood the detail about some of the sustainable transport measures, the accessibility. So once we've got the detail, we can maybe go back and answer the bigger question about paragraph 105. So is it the same with the green belt then as well? Because what the MDPF is saying is have regard to promoting sustainable patterns of development. So if, propose a hypothetical situation here, if sites were considered to be unsustainable, do you think that they would be, obviously we talked about the strategy and whether or not it would be justified under paragraph 105, but if a site was unsustainable in that context, would it also be justified in the greenbelt context? Just see the question I'm posing there, is it, if it was considered unsustainable, you think it would meet the requirements of national plan policy, which says that it needs to promote sustainable patterns of development?
I mean, the whole purpose is to try and promote a plan of sustainable development. That's the plan. So, we believe that the sites that we've chosen are sustainable. And that's part of the strong justification for their release.
That was a critical part of the decision, the high level strategic decision as to whether or not the state sites out in greenbelt. This was part of the council's front and centre consideration of these sites.
Yes.
I think so. That is correct, but I think even where you've got what would you say is sustainable sites, that in itself wasn't sufficient to greenbelt. We had to then look at the exceptional, whether we had the exceptional circumstances to take them out. There may be sustainable sites, but we looked at whether the essentially the bar in the MPPF in terms of greenbelt release was met.
Yeah, in terms of sustainability, not just about accessibility.
Yes.
Yeah, good morning, sir. Thank you very much. I'm just going to continue the theme that you've just raised there, but just step back one step first. For development for the green belt to be reviewed and changed requires, as we all know, the passing of the exceptional circumstance test, and that rightly is a high bar. And therefore, you are right to explore with the council whether they've explored all other opportunities to avoid incursions to the green belt. If, having concluded that there isn't sufficient capacity in those non-green belt locations, the framework is then clear as it goes into paragraph 142. It then takes on, if you sort of address the brownfield capacity points and neighbouring authorities and so forth, it then provides guidance on a more locational perspective. And it is a very clear steer that the location has to be the right one. And bearing in mind that the exceptional circumstance point is a high bar, that location also needs to be in a qualitative sense, in terms of the test is promoting sustainable patterns of development in a very good location to meet that high bar. Now, clearly there are other considerations to landscape and so forth, but the framework in terms of the greenbelt context is promoting sustainable patterns of development. That is the relevant, weighty material consideration in terms of the location of where those greenbelt amendments could occur. Now, I'm not going to go over what was briefly discussed yesterday or what may be discussed under matter 6, but the Tudley Village proposal equally has to meet that very high bar of securing a sustainable pattern of development. And that includes ensuring that sustainable behaviours are embedded right from the outset. And I don't believe, given the characteristics of Tudley Village as a location or scheme, that that's going to be possible. And therefore, having regard to 142, I'm not too sure that the Tudley Village proposal is going to meet the quite rightly high bar of paragraph 142. And when I read in the council's statement, it's under question, this is question 6 of paragraph 71, they refer to Tudley Village being in a highly sustainable location. And that terminology, in my view, is displaying, I think, a slight degree of defensiveness on part of the council. But clearly, it can't be described as that. Yet that is a phrase that's been used in order to try and secure compliance with 142 of the framework. When I hear Mr. Scully referring to the strategy and the fact that we need to avoid the A&B for strategic development, therefore leaving few opportunities left to consider, that's not quite, with the greatest respect, the correct approach. The approach of 142 is promote sustainable patterns of development by location. In terms of major development in the green belt, that is exceptional circumstances too. And you may find that those exceptional circumstances does justify alternatives to the Tudley Village option, similar to the employment allocation within the AONB, where the council concluded exceptional circumstances arose that justified that allocation. And that is in part through promoting sustainable patterns of development. So I think the answer to your question, sir, is the council has not taken either into account or into sufficient account the need to comply with 142 to justify in particular the Tudley Village allocation. And that's a fundamental issue that arises from not only your question, but also this plan. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It seems to me there are two elements in the question that you've asked. One of them is to what extent has sustainability been taken into account in rejecting other sites, for example, on the basis they're unsustainable. The second element is the extent to which the sustainability of the allocated or chosen greenbelt site is relevant. So I'm not going to say any more about the first of those than has already been covered in discussion of brownfield and optimizing density. I want to concentrate on the extent to which sustainability has been taken into account in choosing the sites the council's looked at. So on that, I agree with everything that Mr. Bond has said. I might even take it one stage further and say that in my submission, this isn't a world where you say, have we got exceptional circumstances? And then you go on to ask whether a site is sustainable. In my submission, the sustainability or unsustainability of the site is an essential component of deciding whether or not the particular greenbelt release, whether exceptional circumstances exist for that. And I say that, sir, because exceptional circumstances is not a question you can answer in the abstract. You always have to look at the particular harms to the landscape, to the greenbelt, to everything else, to sustainability of the site in question. Do exceptional circumstances exist for this particular release? And so in those circumstances, in this case, we say it's difficult to see how sustainability can properly have been taken into account. And you'll forgive me, sir, if these are points that are going to come back to under the session on Tuesday. But as you know, it's my client's particular interest, and it does have a bearing on the basic methodology questions you've asked under the Greenbelt session. First and most obvious point, sir, is one of employment. The council's strategy in terms of new employment is to put it all in the A21 corridor. It has no connection whatsoever with the two major housing allocations, which are all greenbelt releases. They are about as far apart as you get them. But sir, more importantly, or at least as importantly, is the point Mr. Bond makes about embedding sustainable transport in these new settlements from the word go. So when we were last here, I made the point that I can't think of another case in which a local authority has proposed a new garden settlement which has all the disadvantages of being cut in half by a major public transport connection such as a railway line, without at the same time taking the corresponding benefit of being able to get on the train within that settlement. There are plenty of garden village proposals around which take advantage of railway stations and are cut in half by the railway line, but they do that because you can walk from your front door and get on the train. That is something which nobody who lives in Chudley is going to be able to do. And so one of the reasons why that matters is if you go back to the Reg 18 stage, at that point, Chudley was being proposed on the basis that there was at least the potential for a train station. And at that point, you might understand the glimmerings of an idea that this could be a sustainable settlement. But we now know that that is not going to happen. And what we don't see anywhere is anybody going back to the drawing board and saying, well, hang on a minute, that original idea of a sustainable settlement with its own train station, that's not going to happen anymore. Is this still the right place? Bearing in mind, it's going to have the railway line going through the middle of it. And so you know from the date, for example, at which the transport evidence has been produced to this inquiry, much of that transport evidence necessitated precisely because the council now knows it's going to have to find a way of getting Chudley residents to one or other of the train stations in Cadderwood or Tunbridge without causing adverse effects. That evidence postdates the whole idea. So how can it possibly be said that sustainability has been taken into account in the choice of greenbelt releases in this particular case? So as far as we can see, it simply has not.
So can we touch on those points when we come to consider tube? And not losing it.
Yeah, and this wants to come back and the wider points on sustainability.
I don't know if you want to take all the comments.
Oh, sorry, yes, we'll go gentleman at the back, then we'll come back on this side of the table.
I enjoy Mr. Marlowe's description of the current efforts to find more brownfield housing. But I get this nagging feeling that wasn't done at the time of selecting a strategy that puts 50% of the housing in the green belt. During my time of looking at the numbers, I got the council's publicly available brownfield register for both 2019 and 2017, and they weren't very expensive. I ran planning in 2019, the lady said yes, more work was going to be done. I'm not going to quote anymore, to be fair, but I think the issue is of what work is being done now. Was enough work done at the time of adopting the strategy to exceptional circumstances, and I'm not convinced it was.
Yes, Miles.
So if I just go first and then Ms. Miles goes after, just very shortly. Just to repeat the point that was said by the council in respect of Tudor, it was justified on the basis of something that could be made sustainable, not that it was sustainable. And we endorse what Mr. Brown said as well. You don't look in the abstract. You've got to look, particularly if it's been justified on it's going to be made sustainable, how that's going to be made sustainable. And the point I made yesterday is now that, and Mr. Brown will, I remember debating this elsewhere, the baked-in costs of new roads and new things are also part of the question of sustainability now. And none of that's been done. And quite apart from what Mr. Brown has said, in terms of not only this site, but also, and I hand over to Ms. Miles, other sites have been rejected. There hasn't been that audit that you require, as Mr. Brown says, on exceptional circumstances, on the actual facts of the case, each site.
Thank you. I don't want to repeat the point, but there has been, in our view, an absence of a sense check. And that application of balance. The sites have been ruled out by the Greenbelt assessment at an early stage through the Red 19 reps. Sites that have been put forward responses in relation to why they've been ruled out. Safe People have pointed to 43 sites and invited the council to review those. We can't find any evidence where that review has then been undertaken. So our point is that sites in Greenbelt or sites around the edge of Tunbridge Wells have been ruled out at a very early stage on Greenbelt location alone, without then a review of those individual sites and the benefits that those sites could offer. And we consider that to be flawed.
Okay, Councillor, any final comments on this? I know a lot of it's tricky, so a lot of it goes into the strategy and what we were talking about before, and then a lot of it goes into the devil's in the detail, we'll get onto it. Yeah, gentlemen of the back, there's not red tile.
All right, Adler Estate. I only want to make a short point, but obviously there's been a number of comments made in the last session about specific points. I don't think you'll appreciate me trying to rebut all the points now, but I will be talking about them on 4th of June when it's the appropriate time.
Yeah, I think obviously we'll get into the detail as we said that yesterday, the strategy, some of the comments. Gentlemen at the back.
Yes, I just like a clarification from the council, because as I see it, the figures, the housing figures in the apartment that taking out from the rebuild is really unchanged from what was in my in 2020, and which informed the pre-submission of the plan. Now, I thought that the council, the person for the council has said, sorry, I didn't get the name, that the study of the town centre and town centre sites and the review of Tunbridge Wells' sites, which is ongoing, has been taken into account. And I don't see that there's any reflection of that in the figures of the housing need and the effect of COVID and working from home, at least things which I imagine that they're looking at. There's been no change in the figures since, let's say, 2020. And how is it going to change with the new, with all the work that's been done?
These are the point we touched on Wednesday in the housing needs, wasn't it, about the methodologies used and projections and how things have changed.
But earlier today, there was a talk about the figures being taken into account in the town centre study itself. And yet the original figures date from planning figures from really when the fifth project was still ongoing and other things, and the town centre concept has changed a lot since then.
I understand the point. Yeah, as I say, we have moved forward. We are looking at the town centre very comprehensively. We still believe there is scope for further residential development in the town centre. I think if I can just come back to the broader points, yes, as has been said, in terms of sustainability, paragraph 105 of the NPPF highlights the managing patterns of development, locations which are or can be made sustainable, and that's the council's argument in relation to Julie, and that is for another day. I think in terms of the employment pattern, obviously there are the council promoting substantial employment growth at Paddock Wood, accessible. Tunbridge Wells will still remain by far the principal urban area, and it's appropriate that there's employment growth there, and we talked under the employment needs about the strategic benefits of that site. It's also, I'm bound to say, a smaller scale than is being promoted by Mr. Bond in this site. Just in terms of strategy, just to remind you, I don't want to get back to sustainability equation, but we did look at options that met the need without greenbelt sites. Indeed, we looked at a low level of need as well, by taking out the greenbelt sites. So those options have been considered at a strategic level.
Okay, any final comments or observations then on this issue for proposing or take a break, then come back afterwards to look at the actual methodology of how the council assessed their greenbelt? Yeah, any final comments from the back?
Thank you, sir. Coming towards town forward, just picking up on Mr. Marino's point about the density area. It does strike this as slightly strange that something which is actually fundamental to plans as a whole is not being considered as part of this process, even though that plan may be expected to bring forward this group of presently unidentified sites. And just as a point of information, sir, just in recent weeks, the Logistics UK headquarters on St John's Road, which is an extremely suspected site, has begun to be promoted by the owners of that site with a prospect of over 40 dwellings. Similarly, Mitsubishi Motors of Japan have decided they're not going to sell the motor cars in this country, and the current dealership, which is near Grosvenor Bridge, again in the St James area, also a very sustainable location,
for more than 10 dwellings. I wouldn't be exactly sure, but it certainly probably up to 20. It's apartments. Has come up very, very recently. I think so. We can, on the basis of what has been happening in the past, and projecting that forward, we can see that with rising land values and with suboptimal site use, that there will be a constant flow of the medium-sized sites. Now, it doesn't seem terribly germane to the local plan that we've got 40 coming up, and with 40 plus 20 plus 40 plus 50 drip, going far beyond the roof concept. It is material, and these are all sites which are actually highly sustainable, which increase the density, which increase the intensification of use, and which we strongly support.
Okay, thank you. Any final comments from the council before I take a break?
Well, just very briefly, I think understand the points. There's nothing that's coming up at the moment that changes the council's position. We obviously monitor, and aware of developments that come forward, and what's put forward isn't necessarily what's approved, but we do. Nothing that's come up that really changes our position. Obviously, we keep on track.
Okay, we'll have a break and we'll come back after that to talk about the review methodology with a greater detail. Should say just over 15 minutes, 20 past. Is that okay? Yeah. I'll assume 20 past 11. So we'll resume and continue. Moving on to issue 2, we'll start to look at the Greenbelt review methodology. Useful to start at the beginning and with regards to the stage 1. And the first 2 questions about the stage 1 and stage 2, and we'll sort of move through this on some of the details, especially on stage 3. I think it's worthwhile just the benefit of the hearing and those here. The council could just sort of quite briefly and succinctly just explain what the stage 1 Greenbelt study was and its purpose, and then how that's then progressed into the stage 2 study, and again the stages at which they were produced, what the council was doing, how they informed the local plan, and just sort of take us through from the start really. The useful description.
The stage 1 study, so it was a strategic study to look at the Greenbelt for the whole borough and identify broad areas, including land that went beyond the borough boundary and also into areas where there was non-Greenbelt land where it might possibly make a contribution. And the end of that process was to identify parcels which might be taken forward for a more detailed study at stage 2.
So it wasn't about allocations, anything like that?
No, it was a general background strategic study to understand the general strength of the Greenbelts and its contributions.
So parcels, okay, put the question in the air. How did it determine what should then be taken forward and considered at stage 2?
The stage 2 study, so, was to identify land for further consideration where it had a particular relationship to the Greenbelt. Set out in our hearing statements, nice details of that. So the boundaries were drawn where there was a change in relationship between settlements and countryside. Typically, such changes are marked by a relationship in clear physical features. It wasn't too, and it was at a reasonable scale where those parcels showed a clear change. The number of parcels identified for potential at stage 1 increased at stage 2 because it was a much more detailed assessment, more field work, etc. And so a number of additional parcels were identified, or the parcel boundaries were modified, and there were additional parcels around Tunbridge Wells, Rustall, and Paddlewood.
So is it at stage 2 where the council or the assessment started to consider likely harm from the lease?
It did consider harm, sir. It considered the contribution to the purposes, each of the purposes, in a very detailed way. And that information and results was part of the consideration the council made in going through sustainability appraisal and Sheila to come to a view on any particular allocation within the broad area or within the parcel.
Okay, so obviously sounds like stage 2 was where you start to consider, contributions to the purposes of impeding land and Greenbelt, likely harm. So what stage was that produced? And how did it inform decisions about strategy, about sites?
So that's set out, so in the distribution and development topic paper for the Regulation 18 consultation. I touched on that briefly earlier today. But you'll see references to the stage 2 throughout that process, and including at Appendix 1. There is a table showing the sites that are then proposed, and it includes the various contributions to each, it firstly references the parcel or broad area in which it falls within, and it references the contribution to purposes 1 to 4, talks about mitigation, and provides some notes on council judgments. It's just a sort of, obviously just a summary of what the council has done. And that information was available to officers as doing part of the Sheila and as the sustainability appraisal.
Okay, so having that information and having that sort of understanding at that stage, what then was the purpose and role of the stage 3 assessment?
Clearly, there was a lot of comment at stage 18 and concerns over Greenbelt, quite rightly, but also the council needed to be sure that the policies that supported those releases were adequate, and we needed to inform particularly mitigation and understand any detailed nuances about contribution of Greenbelt to any part of the site and how that might be reflected in policy.
So the stage 2, once the stage 2 assessment informed the Reg 18. Yes, is that right? Yeah. So when did the stage 3 assessment, was that produced?
That was produced in the run-up to, as in autumn 2020. Sorry, let me just check. So this was November 2020, and was an assessment of the sites at that time that we considered were suitable, and I say it was there to primarily really to provide that level of detail we wanted for the mitigation and particularly to inform things like master planning and so on.
In terms of the decision making there, is it fair to say that the stage 2 assessment informed the council's decision making on things like strategy, strategic sites?
Yes, absolutely, sir.
So it's a stage 2 assessment.
Yes.
Any comments just on what we've heard so far before we get to some of the details? Yes, Jennifer, the right hand side.
I think it's very clear from the timing that the council had decided on their strategic sites and had the embarrassment that their Greenbelt study 2 showed that both of them would cause very high harm to the Greenbelt. I think the purpose of the third Greenbelt study was to downgrade that assessment. It's really interesting that the first published version of the stage 3 report, which was in March 2021, shows that although in the main body of the report, the harm has been downgraded, they had overlooked the fact that in the summary, which unusually appears at the end of the report, the summary still says the assessment of harm are summarised in chapter 4 and depending on location range from low harm associated with the release of land around Speldhurst and Pembury to very high harm at Chudley Village and Paddock Wood. So when the report was published, it still said it was very high harm. In the main body, the assessments had been downgraded, but somehow they haven't updated, and I have a copy here. The next point I would make is that, and then the report had to be amended later and was republished, and that's what's on the website now. I think it's noticeable that the council is choosing to build on the 2 of the 15 parcels considered in the Greenbelt study, which have arguably a high or a very high level of harm. And it's also clear that other sites were rejected, despite the fact that they caused less harm to the Greenbelt. Several of the assessments in Greenbelt Study 3 were downgraded, but it still left a strong contribution to Purpose 3, which is safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. The reduction in the harm in Purpose 2, preventing the merging of neighbourhood towns, from strong to relatively weak, that makes no sense. The cumulative effect of the 2 garden villages means that the space between Tunbridge and Paddock Wood will be virtually filled. In fact, I calculate that if you drive from the north end of Tunbridge down through Five Oak Green and through Paddock Wood, which is a 10-mile drive, the only real gap will be between Tunbridge and Chudley, a gap of about a mile. So I think it's very clear that the purpose of the Greenbelt Study 3 was to downgrade the harm, and it makes it logical. Now, I would also say that the other change in the report is that in the Study 2, the assessment, the summary assessment, has now been changed in 3. In Stage 2, if an allocation or a plot of land makes a strong contribution to one or more of the Greenbelt purposes, then the overall harm was regarded as very high. In Greenbelt 3, it says that if it needs to make a strong contribution to more than one. So there are 2 ways in which it's been diluted. One, in the bar has been raised, and secondly, the individual assessments of harm have been reduced. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and keep my answer within the parameters of the way you put this. You've asked a series of questions about the chronology and when decisions were made. I say that, sir, because rather like the comment you just heard, in due course, I've got some observations to make about Stage 3 and the reliability of what was done. I don't want to get there yet. What I want to do is just to pick up the point that you made with council in terms of what was the critical stage in the decision making, and the picking up also on the fact that Stage 3 made that, whether or not it's a retrospective justification. What you've heard is very, very clear that in terms of the critical decision, that was made at Stage 2 and not Stage 3. And that has to be right, not only in terms of the timing, but also, so one of the things that you know about Stage 3 is that although it went ahead and did a more detailed review, although it looked at mitigation, it only carried out that exercise in relation to the allocated sites. So there has never been a like-for-like comparison of the allocated sites with all the rejected sites, which takes into account that further detail or the consideration of mitigation. And of itself, sir, I do say that is a fundamental point. That when you're deciding which is the best greenfield rebuild site to release, one of the things that you might do before deciding what you're going to allocate is have a look at the extent to which impacts can be mitigated, or where the more detailed work reveals that the impacts are as great as you first suggested. But where we are, on the basis of what you've heard from the council in response to your question, is the council's justification for the choices it's made have to be established. The evidence base for it is what you've got at Stage 2. And so that's in circumstances where The stage 2 assessment doesn't actually say what its purpose does, but both the stage 1 and stage 3 assessments are pretty clear that their purpose is not to identify land suitable for development. They both say that. I mean, it may well be that stage 2 was supposed to do that, but it's kind of odd then that 1 and 3 both say that's not what they're there to do, but stage 2 was. But in any event, so what we know is that at stage 2, you've got 15 sites considered, 13 are assessed as low to moderate harm, 2 and only 2 are assessed as causing very high harm, and those are the 2 that end up being the allocations. And it's extremely difficult in those circumstances to see how the stage 2 assessment has, if I say it's informed the choice, clearly the council had the information there, but it's difficult to see how it has shaped the choice that the council has made. Because ordinarily, if you did an assessment which came out saying these 2 have got very high harm and everything else is much better, the starting point would let's go for the sites that have got lesser harm. At the very least, it calls for a clear explanation from the council of why it is that, having identified Tugley and Paddock Wood as giving rise to very high harm, those end up being the preferred choices. But what you cannot get is the answer to that question out of the stage 2 assessment. That just tells you what the level of harm is. It doesn't explain how the council has gone on from there to choose those 2 particular sites. I'll keep my powder dry on stage 3 and other criticisms for a little later. So.
Thank you, sir. A few points to make for your note, if you would. The first has already been adequately and eloquently expounded by the 2 gentlemen who spoke before me, but in essence, it goes to the heart of the refrain you've heard a number of times before, which is that the council appear to have alighted on their strategy and then justified it through the use of the Greenbelt studies and other documentation, particularly in the light of the strategic allocations being in areas of very high harm to the Greenbelt, and other areas being of moderate or lesser harm, certainly. And I appreciate that the studies in themselves don't necessarily indicate that Greenbelt land should be released or otherwise. There's a wider discussion about exceptional circumstances, which you've said you will address once you've heard the detail of the strategic allocations of Tugley and Paddock Wood. But clearly, if there is very high harm to releasing a site from the Greenbelt, then the exceptional circumstances ought to be appropriately higher than if there were moderate harm in releasing sites from the Greenbelt. So first point is that. Second point is really to do with the methodology. And again, it's in my representation, but very briefly, sir, it seems as though the stage 2 study was to identify smaller parcels of land at a more granular level than the stage 1 study. And paragraph 4.2 of the study sets out that the parcels that were studied identified represent areas in which there was considered to be a possibility that land may not be found to make a strong contribution to Greenbelt purposes. My view on that, sir, is that you do a study to identify which parcels of land might not make a contribution to Greenbelt purposes, not necessarily make some assumptions about which land might not make a contribution to Greenbelt purposes, and then study them. It seems that's the wrong way round. So that's the brief point, so it's in the representations.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We're on question 3, and I'm going to answer, if I may, so with your leave, just touching on question 4 and then not come back on question 4, because there's a degree of overlap, because question 3, how did they fit together, and then And it's the point that's been confirmed by the council in answer to your question, which Mr. Brown referred to, is the key decision-making took place as far as it did at stage 2. And what hasn't happened, as Mr. Brown said, is a fair assessment of the sites that were rejected at the earlier stage 2 process with the stage 3 assessment that took place. And in fact, there is agreement with the council. If you go to the council's representations, page 10 of 15, question 4, paragraph 18, the council says, regardless of whether the harm identified harm was high, very high, or indeed even where the harm was low, in each location where alterations of greenbelt boundaries have been considered, planning judgment was required to establish whether sustainability of greenbelt release and any benefits of associated development outweigh the harm to the greenbelt designation, whether, quote, exceptional circumstances exist to warrant that release. And broadly, we agree with that. But what we say, and I think what Mr. Brown says, and what everyone, most of the representatives say, that should have been carried out, apart from whether it's defective, nothing about its quality, that should have been carried out for the sites that have been rejected at stage 2. And if you go to our representations, and I won't repeat them, so that's essentially the points we make at 3.4 and 3.5, but then in answer particularly question 4, 3.7, and then the key point is 3.8. And it's just one line, so I will read it. It's apparent, therefore, that the site selection process has occurred independently of the stage 3 greenbelt assessment and is unsound. And that's fundamentally our point, and I believe the same point that Mr. Brown is making. The site selection process occurred independently at an earlier stage without carrying out what the council themselves say should be done at paragraph 18.
And 19, if you read the first sentence, Mr.
And
key to that planning judgment.
And 19 as well.
Key to that planning judgment was knowing what level of harms likely to rise as we set out at stage 2.
Thank you, sir. And that's all right.
Okay, we'll come back on these points, but just hoping Mr. Bond, please.
Thank you, sir. Wanted to endorse Mr. Brown had said earlier about the need for a like-for-like basis assessment of central allocation sites for different sites. The second point I wanted to highlight and reinforce, so these are green belt studies, not A and B or any other matter. So it's purely looking at functions and levels of harm associated with the green belt. So with that last point in particular in mind, sir, I'm still confused as part of the plan making process how through the green belt assessments they originally identified 33 parcels and 10 broad areas. How those broad areas were defined at the exclusion of some of the smaller parcels. And the obvious example is, for instance, right at the stage 1 assessment, there was the broad areas 1 and 2, which effectively lie between Royal Tunbridge Wells and Tunbridge. And quite clearly, if you're looking at that broad area between 2 large urban areas, you are going to find significant levels of harm. Now, but what never occurred, either at the stage 1 process or the stage 2 process, was a finer grain analysis of certainly which is common with most greenbelt assessments of individual parcels of land at the respective urban edges of the towns. And throughout the processes of stages 1, 2 and 3, those broad areas 1 and 2 to the north of Tunbridge Wells remain the same, irrespective of whether emission sites, Sheila assessments have or have not been carried out. You end up with a process where you will always see high levels of harm associated with those broad areas. Immediate. I'm not going to just talk about North Tunbridge Wells, on other cardinal points of Tunbridge Wells too, and that does not seem to be a effective and justified assessment to find the most appropriate locations for potential greenbelt amendments. And if there had been a finer grade assessment, the council, from a greenbelt perspective, may have ended up with a greater number of alternatives to consider, which in turn, if those had been identified and let's say rejected, that may have justified or provided sufficient support for their eventual decision to allocate Chudley Village, but it didn't. And that lack of a finer grain assessment does call into question the soundness and justification and positivity of the plan making process in respect of where greenbelt boundaries should be reviewed, or certainly at least considered. And I suppose the last point to make, sir, the approach that the council took in relation to the employment application right from the outset, by comparison to broad area 2 to the north of Tunbridge Wells, is a classic example of an inconsistent approach. We're not going into site specifics, but there is a definitely missed opportunity, which, to my mind, exposes a flaw in the greenbelt assessment process.
Okay,
just to come back on the one of the earlier points about the change in the wording of the report. It's quite clearly from the body what the answer should have been. It is just a typographical error, and both reports have been published and are available, and the council sticks by that judgment. It's important to realise that what the stage 2 study actually did, sir, and for that I'd like to take you to the stage 2 study. And firstly, this would be on page 29. If you look at the contributions that match.
Sorry, page 20.
This would be page 29. Yeah, paginated page 29. And you can see in terms of the areas and parcels identified, areas like BA4, for instance, to the north of Chudley, as a weak or no contribution there. And you can see sites around Paddockwood have a weak or no contribution. And you can see some sites around Tunbridge Wells which have strong to moderate and so on. If you go to the next page, purpose 2, which is preventing neighbouring towns from merging into one another, there's generally a stronger contribution to areas around Chudley and Paddockwood, principally about the separation that area provides between Tunbridge and Paddockwood and between Tunbridge Wells and the other 2 settlements. And then you can see in purpose 3, assist to safeguard the countryside from encroachment. Not surprisingly, most areas unrelated to the settlement have a strong contribution. And then you can look at the next page, purpose 4, for the settings of historical towns. And there's a generally weaker contribution further away you are from rural Tunbridge Wells because of the historical nature of the setting. And as was pointed out by one of the respondents, the harm attributed to this work in the table, which is on page 28, reflects just the highest contribution. And you can see in that table 6.1 that for each of those parcels and areas, a rating is given for every single purpose. And so that information was available to officers to make their deliberations about the particular merits of those areas. The suggestion that we should have carried out a more granular assessment, I think misunderstands the purpose of the Greenbelt study, is to assess areas of Greenbelt on an even playing field. Whilst there are some quite clearly identified emission sites represented by people at the table today, there are literally hundreds of submitted sites. What those developments would contain, exactly what part of that site, submission site, might be developed and might be left as open space, is not evident on all those sites. And even on some of the sites that have been discussed around the site at the table today, they've had varying degrees of proposals, such as Castle Hill, 400, 900, 1,600 houses. It would be impossible to assess every single one of those options. Give a level playing field to an assessment of what the Greenbelt contribution makes. It's more appropriate to identify those parcels and areas, the contribution they make, and then as a planning judgment, look at what's being proposed as a site and come to a view on how that interacts with the Greenbelt and the necessary tests that need to be met. I have with us, so you can explain that sometimes authorities may well have done emission sites because they've reached a certain stage in their plan, or there's a particular screening that's gone on beforehand. But each plan is different and the approach is taken different. Tunbridge Wells believes the approach is taken in this case is entirely appropriate and robust and provided the basis for that decision making. Is to say that sites were rejected on the basis irrationally on findings at the stage 2 does not represent the full amount of work that officers undertook in terms of the essay and the Sheila, the site visits and the considerations of the applications, the submissions that were received. I can come on to stage 3 and the difference in harm rating. As I say in our statement, harm rating is just a value that we try and place on it. There's no methodology, published methodology for undertaking Greenbelt assessments. And what we're trying to do is a relative study. So it's relative to every parcel and area. It's not surprising we would use a finely grained assessment for stage 3 because we're looking at particular sites and want to extract more information, particularly about mitigation. And it did use a different scale. So there's nothing surprising in that, there's nothing unusual in that, and there's nothing underhand about it. We do recognise that this is a big release of Greenbelt. And this is not a decision, I think sometimes the idea is these decisions are taken lightly. Officers live in this area, some of us have worked in this authority for many years. It's a difficult decision and a very difficult decision for members. And so, there is likely to be concern. We do need to understand it as much as possible and make sure we're making the right decision and provide the level of mitigation that's most appropriate. So I don't know whether I've missed any questions there.
So can I just draw your attention to the executive summary, stage 2 assessment, just to explain the ratings. paragraph 1.4 says an overall rating was given to each ward area and parcel to indicate the level of harm that could be caused to the greenbelt were the area in question to be released. This rating reflected the highest contribution to any of the first 4 greenbelt purposes. So therefore, when it says high or very high, it's reflecting that. But when we get to stage 3, of course, it's more nuanced. Therefore, other factors are taken into account. And that's why there might be a slight disparity in terms of raising. It's a different methodology in essence.
So stage 2 assessments. I was going to ask a question, but another one's popped into my head as I was thinking. But does that not go to the heart of what the representatives are saying? Is that at the stage 2, it was considering harm to the purpose of including land and greenbelts. Stage 2 assessment considered the harm from releasing these parcels against the greenbelt purposes, i.e., and the gentleman there's just taken us through those. It wasn't considering harm in the same way as a stage 3 assessment. Is that right?
That's right. It wasn't considered exactly the same way. Do you want
So
to explain?
So when the council was making decisions about which sites to allocate, is it the case then that when the council already sat there making decisions on which sites to allocate, you only had information on the harm of releasing those sites against the purpose of including land in the greenbelt? You didn't then have the more detailed assessment of harm because that came at stage 3. You didn't have that.
So at the stage 2, sorry, it's very young LUC. So at the stage 2 study, what we were doing there is looking at the contribution that land makes to greenbelt purposes.
Yeah.
At the same time, we were also considering the potential impact on the integrity of the wider greenbelt. And that was all wrapped into one judgment, effectively. And that was the judgment of harm, because that's what harm is. It's the contribution it makes to the greenbelt, the impact on the wider greenbelt, and that equates to harm. In the stage 3 study, it was more nuanced because what we did was separate out the consideration of contribution and the impact on adjacent greenbelt, because that section on the impact on adjacent greenbelt is really useful to councils in order to inform their mitigation measures. So it wasn't a different assessment, it's a presentation of the assessment of harm in a slightly different way.
Okay.
So it had a different rating scale. So in the case of Tudley, for example, it came out as high as opposed to very high. And we could set out, obviously, on the site there, the justification for that. But it wasn't, the principles of the assessment were the same. And I would suggest that the stage 2 study, having done greenbelt studies for over 50 local authorities and being found sound at examination, all the ones that have been tested, that the study that we prepared for Tunbridge Wells in the stage 2 was adequate for them to be able to then consider alongside other factors. We just looked at greenbelt, the performance of land and the potential harm to the greenbelt in order for them to rationally consider what sites they may want to take forward.
And I think it says that, doesn't it, in the next steps section of the stage 2 study. There's also analysis of greenbelt contribution compared to assessments of environmental land value, landscape, biodiversity, and sustainability of potential developments, determining a range of potential development scenarios. So the question I was going to ask, as a council, you have this evidence, you have this information, and figure 6.5 in the stage 2 study, potential level of harm to the greenbelt associated with the recent release of land parcels. That's just one example where you've got this different levels of harm. I think it's the point that Mr. Smith was making earlier. So you had this information which demonstrated different levels of harm. So how then did you weigh that into the balance? Because when you go back to the SA, this, I don't want to go back too much into the SA, but this was the point that we raised in week 1. In the SA, under the land use, it seems to me that on every land use heading where you've got releasing the greenbelt, it scores a double negative. And it says would really result in the release of greenbelt land, double negative, red, okay, we understand that. But I think the point Mr. Smith and others are making is actually a bit more nuanced than that, saying, well, site A could be completely different from site B, because site A, they're both in the greenbelt, but site A could be have far less impact on. So how did you sort of really get into the detail of that in your decision making about, okay, well, we've got a site here, do you know what, it's going to cause very high harm to the greenbelt, but it's got all these other benefits. Yeah. It's highly accessible, might be a little bit of brownfield land, whatever's making things up, but it's, whereas you've got another site which might be slightly less accessible, would maybe have a lower harm to the greenbelt. So where's that decision making?
That decision is made as the planning judgment through things like the Sheila and the officer's judgments. But what I'd like to take you to is to actually look at what the actual parcel information is. So this is the appendix to the stage 2. I'm looking here, I think it's the electronic page, or page 146 as an example, which is parcel TW5, which happens to include 2 of the objectives that are here today, I believe, potential mission sites. So if you look at that page, apart from the mapping evidence it gives you showing the relationship of built development and so on in the parcel area, there is a description of the development land use. There is a description of the parcel boundaries. It discusses in some detail the relationship between settlement and countryside. It then gives a bit more detail on the contribution to greenbelt purposes, why each purposes is relevant and the strength is given. And then it gives an indication of the greenbelt boundary strength. So it's given us all the information about looking at that parcel or broad area in relation to any particular application to make a judgment.
So where then is that taken forward? So where do you set that out? Where do you do that sort of made up scenario by just saying, okay, well actually this is going to be really quite hard to access, but there's all these other benefits, therefore the application is justified.
That would be through the Sheila mostly, in judging the site and the review of that, yes.
So obviously we'll also discuss the Sheila this afternoon, site selection methodology. So does that then set out in the Sheila, does that say, we cross refer then to the stage 2 and say, yes, site A had it very high.
And that's explained in the distribution and development topic paper that that evidence has been was prepared to enable officers to make that kind of judgment.
So if I would just say that's the key document that's ahead of the child local plan, the distribution of development paper sets out site by site basis. Which set up exceptional circumstances and the judgment over the borough-wide and then a site-by-site basis.
So is that the Reg T?
The Reg 18 part, that then that's obviously is then taken forward. That points us to where that's a visual consideration is made. When greenbelt release was first proposed, that's
So the discussion that we've just been having, particularly, leaves me with this fundamental question: what is it that the council is asking you to do with the stage 3 analysis? If you read its main matter statement, paragraph 18 tells you that planning judgment about sustainability benefits and harm is that's at the core of this. And paragraph 19 says key to that planning judgment is knowing what the level of harm is likely to rise, and that is set out in the stage 3 greenbelt study. Now, ordinarily, if you're asking, are there exceptional circumstances, that you want to know what the actual level of harm is. And the council tells you that you find that in stage 3, but that's almost impossible to reconcile with everything that you've heard about the process the council's been through. First of all, they'd already committed themselves at stage 3. Secondly, stage 3 doesn't do the comparative analysis which you would need in order to inform the kind of planning judgment the council is talking about, paragraph 18. And finally, so that's before you even get to the question of how do you explain the very real differences between the results that come out at stage 3 and results that come out at stage 2. And I know, hear the council say, well, we're looking in closer detail at smaller parcels of land. But so when the council was talking about this a moment ago, they were talking about slight changes. If you look at Tudley, we are not talking about slight changes. As we pointed out in our statement, paragraph 35, Greenbelt Purpose 1, a rating of strong and relatively weak, moves to no contribution. Greenbelt Purpose 2, strong, becomes relatively weak. 3, rating stays strong. 4, starts out weak and relatively weak, becomes no contribution. But on 2 of those heads, we've gone from strong to relatively weak. That is a huge shift. And of itself, it calls into question, how you can arrive at such a major difference. But more to the point, sir, if you can arrive at that major difference by drilling down into the detail of the Tudley site, who knows what you might have done if you drilled down into the detail of some of the other sites which were ruled out at stage 2. We don't have the answer to that question. But paragraphs 18 and 19 of the council's main matter statement tell you that those are key, their word, key in the planning judgment about whether exceptional circumstances exist.
Can we come back on that one?
So just hang on just a second. So can I ask you, notwithstanding what this very summarised report says in response, have regard to the topic paper, very important. Have regard to the substance of the stage 2 assessment as it's been drawn to your attention, and also retain, as it were, the sense of proportionality that is required at these stages in order to make properly informed assessments. We say the stage 2 assessment and the information contained in it was entirely adequate and appropriate basis upon which to form judgments about potential allocations. The stage 3 study, as made clear in the council's response, says these greenbelt factors form part of the planning judgment in deciding whether to continue to propose to allocate the sites presently within the report. So it could have affected that outcome, but it didn't. More importantly, stage 3 assessment is, of course, very important when it comes to considering exceptional circumstances on a site-by-site basis, particularly looking at the proposed greenbelt boundaries. So there are functional and qualitative distinctions to be made in relation to each stage of the study and what it's there to inform in terms of the decision-making process. Now, in terms of the difference in the ratings, can I just ask LUC just to explain why we go from one rating to another? And this will actually shed some light on the way in which the methodology changes and the purposes for that.
Yeah. So the broad areas that we've spoken about were identified at the end of stage 1. Purpose 3, the encroachment on the countryside, was the key factor in defining these broad areas. So, even on the edges of large urban areas, in some cases you get a strong distinction
So we were able to say that land would be significant encroachment on the countryside. So we defined broad areas primarily on the basis of that purpose. Now, that meant that we got some very large broad areas that, as I mentioned, went between Tunbridge and Paddockwood. Now, those parcels would have had some bits which were significant for purpose one, which were near to the edge of Tunbridge. Clearly not the whole of that broad area is adjacent to Tunbridge. So when we're looking at Toodley in particular, for example, it's evident that land in Toodley isn't going to make a strong contribution to preventing the sprawl of a large built-up area like Tunbridge, because it isn't adjacent to it, it's just the parts of that broad area are. And for purpose two, again, we've got a large broad area that spans the whole distance between Tunbridge and Paddockwood. So that broad area as a whole, if you were to release all that area, obviously there's going to be very high harm in terms of purpose two. But if you look at any specific site within that, you can say that Toodley, that doesn't occupy the whole gap between the two towns. So the contribution diminishes. But this is a product of the difference in methodology of the two stages. So you'll see in quite a few cases, if you've got the contribution ratings at stage 3 are higher than they were at stage 2, because we split out the elements in which we're considering the impact on the adjacent green belt at that third stage, as Sarah said, to try and give the council a bit more information on mitigation. So what you'll find at stage 3 sometimes is that contribution rating is higher, but we've said there isn't any impact on the adjacent green belt, so that affects the overall harm rating. So it's the way the components have been set out, which means you're going to get some differences in contribution ratings. And the fact that you're looking at specific sites, especially within a broad area, there's bound to be a difference. If you look at any small site within a broad area, it's clear that just because that broad area makes a strong contribution to purpose 2, it doesn't mean that any site within that is necessarily going to be really important. So the council are aware of that when they're making the judgments at stage 2. They're not excluding sites from consideration because it says strong contribution to purpose 2 for this whole broad area. They know that that site release isn't going to remove the gap between two towns. So I think there was enough information in there to make those judgments.
But does that not substantiate the points that representatives have been making? That obviously you said there, well, the council knows that releasing that Bobrov area, they're looking at a reasonable alternative in the SA, for example. You sort of said, well, the council would know that then it wouldn't have this red because it's not the whole area. But how do you know that?
Well, because in the stage 2, there is a detailed description of what the firstly explains about all the purposes in the assessment, and for each purpose explains the role it's playing. And so you can look at the maps and see with a parcel or with an area how that site, if you're considering a site, would relate to that particular purpose. So if it is saying, as we looked at TW5, it's related to a gap between Pembury and between Royal Tunbridge Wells, you can look at a particular site and how it relates to reducing or affecting that gap and make a judgment about that. And as I say, I've come back to the earlier point. If we were to assess emission sites, on what basis would that be? Would it just be the people around the table? Would it be every single site that's been submitted? How would we know what form those developments would take place?
When you looked at reasonable alternatives under the SA, how did you take this into account then?
I'd have to answer the colleague there, so that's not my area. But certainly, if you look at the distribution of development topic paper, it does set out the process. There is a section F, I think it is, which goes through, or section I it is in the most recent one. It goes through about how the judgments were made in relation to each of the sites, and sets that out. For the Reg 18, it uses all the information available from stage 2, and from Reg 18, it's looked at the available information on stage Reg 19 for stage 3. So we're often criticised for not doing enough work, and today we're being criticised for doing too much work.
So just looking at the distribution of developments on paper, the draft local plan.
Yes.
Yeah. So appendix 1, you've got assessment of green belt sites. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. Yes.
So just tell me what that does then. So what are those sites and what does that do?
So they're the sites proposed to be allocated at Reg 18. It looks at the site in terms of greenbelt issues and sets out, say, the various contributions to the purposes and provides some notes on the approach.
Yeah. So was that done for your reasonable alternatives?
That's not a reflection of the sustainability approach. In terms of looking at alternatives, I think Mr. Marlowe explained earlier when we were discussing this. You know, we looked at we looked at sites around Tunbridge Wells as an option. We looked at stuff outside the Greenbelt as an option. You know, those reasonable alternatives were considered. In terms of individual sites, were they ruled out solely on Greenbelt purposes? I mean, it is not just the harm to Greenbelt, it is all these other factors that need to be taken into consideration. It's not a determinative issue in its own right.
Okay, Mr. Jones, and then we'll do it round.
So I'll try and keep it short. So I'm not going to repeat what Mr. Brown and others have said, but I adopt it. And I just want first, Ms. Miles has something to say to add as well, since our site has been drawn into the debate. But before so, can I just take a step back? And I think what's gone wrong here is that the council in stages 1 and 2, where they've actually carried out by stage 2 their decision as to what land is going to be released under the and what's not, have made a mistake in their approach to the MPPF. And they've taken as the overarching tests we've heard. The assessments that were carried out are first 1 and then 2. The assessments of the contributions they've made as a matter of judgment with their consultants of pieces of land or areas against the purposes of the green belt. But that's not the test. The test is, as we know, exceptional circumstances, and there's clear case law now on it. Now's not the time to cite it, but that says it's deliberately wide and lower than very special circumstances. So having applied at the critical decision-making process, as we've heard, the wrong test and excluded sites, they then go on to what they then say is a more nuanced test. We've heard different versions of it, but effectively, the 2 paragraphs Mr. Pratt highlighted, Mr. Brown added, paragraphs 18 and 19, that approach comes at stage 3 on this after the sift has already been done. So they've misapplied, it's too late then. And then what's also very clear from the answers that we're getting is that what's being done is a box ticking exercise, so that you've got different people working in different silos. When you ask quite rightly about, well, how does the SA deal with this? Which is also the environmental assessment. We're told, oh, well, that's not really my job, that's someone else's. And you see, there's supposed to be the assessment of the environmental assessment does include economic, should be feeding in to that stage. So it's fundamentally unsound, the approach that's taken, and the more each step we take, the more it unravels. Then it can't be justified on an assertion of proportionality. In fact, the approach that's been taken is not proportionate, as we'll elaborate, as Ms. Miles will elaborate, because in order to have proportionality, you've got to be applying the right test in the first place to know what's proportionate about it. Proportionality is not an excuse for getting it wrong. And you say, well, it's not proportionate. So you can't make a proportionality judgment on the stage 3 because you've got stage 3 in the test in the wrong place. So proportionality is not the panacea. The Sheila, and Ms. Miles was there, when it comes to the Sheila, that doesn't carry out a stage 3 assessment at stage for the sites that were excluded at stages 1 and 2. And I think Ms. Miles will deal a little bit more in what, as a good example, our particular site, how that's treated in the Sheila.
Thank you. And Mr. Marley referred to TW5, parcel TW5, and has stated that he's looked at the whole parcel and drew comparisons. The emission site represents 23% of parcel TW5. So we're not proposing to take the whole of that parcel out of the green belt, just 23% of that site. And there's been no assessment through the local plan process from just that percentage of release. And we've been referred to the Sheila as where the benefits, the planning judgment, the balancing exercise was undertaken. So if you look at the Sheila site assessment for this site, there's absolutely appendix 2. It's on pages 63 to 64 of 115 of that assessment. There's no mention in that assessment of benefits. There's only mention of harm, and the harm that is mentioned is to the green belt. So we say that the balancing exercise that is referred to at paragraph 18 of the council's matter statement in relation to the green belt assessment stage 3 was not carried out in relation to emission sites. And I just also want to draw your attention, sir, to that Sheila assessment. It refers to the potential yield as 292 units, and the data publication of this in was July 2019. There was an EIA screening request in 2018 for just 100 units. So even the Sheila assessment has assessed far higher level of development than is actually being proposed on the site. Thank you.
Yeah, don't get drawn into considering emission site. I think it's the process.
We just do it by illustration, so we don't want to get
But what I do want to do actually is, this goes back to the point that I was making. Apologies for I just want to make sure I've got it entirely clear in your mind. So if you look at and I was actually looking at the Sheila for the Reg 80, so the earlier stage of the planning performance process, and we'll use the example that's been referred to, which is parcel 99. I think is it. But well, I'm just looking at parcel 99 just because it was what it was open on the screen. And when you go into the Sheila document, and again, you don't set it up, it's just to emphasize the point really. It says in there, so reason, which is the sort of summary, significant concerns about impacts on landscape, pattern, okay, judgment of officers. It says the site is part of the green belt parcel, the release of which would cause high harm. And that goes back to the point that I keep making, is that it appears anyway that when the council was doing this, that this is an example where you've looked at a site that's part of a wider parcel and said, well, that's part of a wider parcel that causes high harm. And that's one of the reasons for not taking it any further.
One of the reasons, sir.
Yeah.
But not necessarily the only reason.
Well, and that's what I'm sort of struggling to understand with it, is he said, oh no, that's part of a parcel that causes really high harm. But then before you said, well, no, we didn't really do that, of course we understood that a smaller site within that parcel, but it would be less harmful, but that's not what we've done.
Well, it may be it still does cause high harm. Without looking at the individual sites and the individual procedures.
But does that not then go back to the point the representative making? But without actually doing that assessment, how do you know? So you're in a sort of planning judgment, making decisions on which sites to allocate. It all comes into the wider thinking, and you've sort of got everything out on the table, so to speak. You say, well, that's in the sort of high harm bracket. So that must have come into your thinking, well, okay, that's not an appropriate site to go for because it's high harm.
Yeah.
But then with the allocated sites, you've then gone through this further to refine them further. I think that's what the representatives are making, is that actually you've done that for some of the sites in and around some trials, for example, which would come to different conclusions.
I don't believe it would have made any difference to our conclusion. Certainly in terms of the strategic sites, there is more evidence than that. And as I say, it's been considering whether the release of the strategic sites is justified on a broader sustainability issue and
appreciate it.
We'll come to that. With the emission sites, say judgments were made, planning judgments were made about those sites in relation to a wide range of matters, including greenbelt, and the greenbelt evidence was available to those officers that made that decision. Whether it's transparent enough at the moment, I can't say, but it's certainly it's set out quite clearly in the distribution development topic papers how that process was gone through.
Just a very simple point. Even if it's true that taken individually, the sites at Tudley and East Capel, if built, would make a relatively weak contribution to the merging of Tunbridge and Paddock Wood. I would say that if both are built, then the degree of harm must be considerably higher, as I evidenced in the looking at the distances. Thank you.
It's a short point in response to Mr. Marlowe's comment that the council couldn't realistically do stage 3 assessment for every single emission site. So I want to make it absolutely clear, it's not our suggestion that that is what should have been done. What you had at stage 2 was a sifted analysis of 15 allocation sites for greenbelt release. There is absolutely no reason why a stage 3 analysis could not have been done for those 15 on the basis that other things had already been rejected. And that would have allowed a proper like for like comparison. And critically so, if you get the kind of changes in effect that we've seen for Tudley as a result of drilling down and looking at a more closely scripted site, if you get those significant changes, bearing in mind that those other 13 sites were already rated at much lower levels of harm, if you could get similar changes by drilling down and looking at those more closely, the difference could have been very stark indeed. I noticed Mr. Marlowe says he doesn't think it would have made any difference. I'm struggling to understand the evidence base on which that comment can possibly be made in circumstances where the analysis has never been done. I mean, effectively what you get is a world where the council seeks to take the benefit of the stage 3 analysis in the overall equation, where it does not allow that same benefit for any of the other sites. So one doesn't know where you would have got to, but there would conceivably have been a situation where you're looking at a choice between 2 large sites, which cause still high levels of harm, and other sites, more numerous in order to make up the same numbers, but significantly lesser levels of harm. That balancing exercise is absolutely fundamental to the question whether exceptional circumstances exist. It's not just the principle of development in the green belt, it's also the levels of harm. Until you can balance those things properly, you cannot make a proper decision. And in this case, that can't happen because the groundwork has not been done.
It did happen part of the stage 3 assessment.
Stage 3?
As far as I'm aware.
Only the allocated sites at stage 3.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. I thought you were talking about those.
I'm talking about the ones that were looked at at stage 2, but not assessed at stage 3.
Misunderstood. So far as the spatial options available to the council are concerned, so they're not very limited. Of course, one takes into account not only the assessment of harm to the green belt, but in looking further at the issue of exceptional circumstances, one has regard to a number of relevant factors which bear on the decision to be made. And the topic paper sets it out very clearly. And it's essential, therefore, to understand that having regard to the limited options available and having regard, very importantly, to the sustainability objectives that need to be met to make a sound plan, regard has to be had to any number of factors that bear on sustainability credentials of potential allocations. Greenbelt is one of those factors. And in so doing, one has then to have regard to the suite of documents which has informed the decision-making process at regulation 18th stage and regulation 19th stage. So that includes, of course, the sustainability appraisal. And in terms of understanding and making appropriate judgments in relation to the issue of exceptional circumstances, it's extremely important, of course, that the stage 3 study identifies in a detailed manner, having regard to available information, which would include in this case actually development briefs, how those impacts on green belt, on the purposes of the green belt and the contributions of those sites, and the effect on the remaining green belt, and any transitions which the development might engender can be dealt with. That is not a matter that can be looked at in relation to every site, including every emission site as well. It's hardly surprising that when you get to that level, which the stage 3 study attempted to evaluate, when you get to that kind of detail, it cannot proportionately be said to be appropriate to apply that across the board. And moreover, given the additional information relating to the sites that came forward for the purposes of the stage 3 study, it would have been an unequal assessment if one were to have taken the board emission sites and compared them to the information which was subsequently forthcoming through the development briefs for the major sites, like Tudor. There is no requirement for a stage 3 study to be undertaken for the purposes of making informed and robust decisions at regulation 18 stage. Had the stage 3 study indicated that the choices taken at that stage should be reviewed, then they could have been reviewed, but there was no need to undertake.
Any comments on stage 3 then? Mr. Jones.
Just very shortly, it's just been said that there's no requirement to have stage 3 or stage, I suppose if on stage, we've got to have stage 1, I suppose. But that's not really the point. The point is very simple. When the critical decision is made, and this is the issue that I think council officers have actually been frank and confirmed. When the critical decision was made, in this case it was stage 2, what was the question that was being asked and what was the information being taken into account? The question that was being asked was not in fact whether there are exceptional circumstances to release land from the green belt set out in the NBPF, and that's the test. It was being asked in a relative assessment on contributions, parcels of land, setting aside the other issues that you've raised there as a whole, or parts of it, on their relative contributions to the green belt. And that fundamental thing being fundamentally wrong and asked at the wrong time is the issue. It's not about whether you have 3 or 4 or 5 or however many stages. It's asking, taking into account the right things at the right time and asking the right question. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so lead us sort of nicely on to sort of conclusion around the exceptional circumstances. Question 6 was just a question for my benefit really on Washington settlements. There's no changes to boundaries of any green belt villages, is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So we talked this week about housing needs, we talked about the strategy, we talked about how and where development needs can be met. And issue 3, the questions there, so the question 1 was really a summary and a concluding point really. So at a strategic level, the exceptional circumstances that exist to alter the green belt boundary, in particular regards to the framework, and if not, how can housing and employment needs be met in another way? And I think we've probably exhausted that one, to be fair. I think we're into getting really now into the detail of these sites, which will be the discussion when we return. One thing I do want to go through is question 2. What was the justification for the new area the green belt proposed? This is to the southwest of Paddock Wood.
So we've provided a small map for you in the text under paragraph 22. You can see that the proposed release of PW1 area would be a very small, awkward shape jutting out to the east. And so it's including that area within the release of Paddock Wood 1 means that the greenbelt boundary will then follow the NPPF paragraph 143F criteria, following a definitive and strong boundary, because at the moment it sort of just stretches across this local countryside. As a consequence of that, you can see a tiny triangle to the west there at the bottom of the picture, sort of southwest, if you like, of Paddock, which projects onto the west side of Coltshill Road. And it just seemed anomalous. It doesn't affect any properties. And to be consistent with 143F, to realign that area with the Coltshill. I think we give an area there. The area is just 1.084 hectares of additional land, and it's just a rationalisation question. And I think, in view of the scale of what's proposed and the matters that it raises, it's justified.
Any comments on?
Just to say the town council was never aware of that being proposed, and this is the first we've sort of seen of where that proposal is being made, that additional green belt. Would it be possible for the town council to at least go away and consider that, have a look at what the
It is in the submission plan, isn't it? Yes. There's a table in the submission plan that changes the route of land, so it's set out.
It's in the table.
Yeah, it was really just a question whether it's possible, because it wasn't clear, despite all the conversations within the strategic sites working group, that was part of the proposal. And I think there are some sensitive areas around there in terms of some green spaces, protected sort of habitats that the town council wanted to check to see, which areas were being proposed for green belt.
Okay, if there's some uncertainty about which area exactly is on the ground, then when we return to the pilot rules there, I'm sure we'll
Thank you.
It's just a quick point, sir. That land is in Cable Parish. Second point is, I'm not quite sure how that land parcel that you've identified, that sort of triangle, is affected by the proposed amendment to the Coles Hill Road in the infrastructure plan.
It wouldn't make any difference because any infrastructure would remain in the green belt.
Okay, any questions? Okay, well, we finished slightly earlier. Hannah, do we have anybody here this afternoon who isn't here now?
Yes.
You could have a change of advocate for, say, the cables, but I don't think that's critical necessarily. I'm expecting this to be able to be here over the lunch break.
That's fine. I was just going to explore the opportunity of an early start. We've got this people going there. Stick to the program. That's fine. We'll return lunch. We'll return back at 2:00. Thank you.